All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to a wonderful roundtable discussion that we're going to have today. The topic of this afternoon's conversation is Black business and economic freedom. But if you were attending the session earlier today or yesterday, there's lots of themes that I think are connecting a lot of the sessions that we're having throughout the conference. So this is a very good thing. So for this session, I'll briefly just introduce our panel, just names and titles, and then we're going to jump into it. They have short bios on the website, so please feel free to check that out. And all of them, you can Google the organizations and find out more about them. But we're just going to jump into conversation. And there's also a Q&A function. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you want to ask questions of the group, click on that and just type those in. We'll be bringing those questions into the conversation, maybe the last third or so of the hour. So please, as they come up, please put them in there so we can have a chance to bring them into the conversation. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Julia Collins, who's the founder and CEO of Planet Forward, Wilmot Allen, who's an entrepreneur, investor, and political economist, Cassie Pittman-Clater, who's the Climo Junior Professor of Sociology at Case Western Reserve University, and Henry McCoy Jr., Professor and Director of Entrepreneurship at North Carolina Central University. So I want to start with the question that hopefully I'm phrasing this in a way that everyone will have some way to approach it. But I've been thinking about sort of wealth and business and the connection between the two for Black people and Black communities in the United States and really across the diaspora. And so, big question, but just curious to hear how all of you would approach this. What role do you believe that Black wealth can play in, sorry, I got to turn my phone off, can play in the creation of Black businesses and increasing Black wealth, not just in the United States, but across the diaspora? And so I think I'll start with Wilmot, see if you have any thoughts on that. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Wilmot.
Great, thank you, Mark. Greetings, everyone, and greetings to my fellow panelists as well. Look, Mark, I think that's a very important question, but I think it has to be reframed. Black wealth or wealth in general now cannot be viewed just in terms of net worth, in terms of financial net worth. I think one of the things that we like to do here in Kenya, the work that I do in Africa and creating economic bridges between the continent and the diaspora really does highlight that. What do I mean by that? Meaning there's wealth in terms of talent, innovation that translates into monetary value. There's wealth in terms of history. I think these are things now that we as Black people in all of our diversity, because it is diverse, there's no homogeneity, I think can really look to and take value in and pride in and begin to leverage. And so I say that because that's exactly, I think, in this economic bridge between Africa and the diaspora is so important. Moving, I think, primarily the African-American community from largely being consumer-based to joint owners of the means of production as we engage with Africa in a meaningful way. I think that it's important to understand that that could be talent that leads to co-managing, co-building companies, could be tech transfer, could be other things other than money. Now they're at our disposal, given where we are in 2021, the legacy that we have in terms of education, financial capital, but influence around the world, and building companies and as consumers, and also that knowledge and being able to kind of direct that towards a Pan-African vision that leads to shared prosperity for the world, but principally, I think initially for members of Africa, people of African descent. So I think it's a very important topic, but just suggest that we broaden our definition of what wealth is and build upon that.
Cassie, do you have any ideas, thoughts?
So I would agree. I think that we see this a lot in terms of cultural production, but not in other forms of industry or economy. So there's a great deal of diffusion, right, of Black culture throughout the diaspora. And that leads to creolization and innovation, right? We see a lot of creative products, but we don't always own the rights, and we don't own the intellectual property. And so I think that is also key. So thinking about how do we prevent some of the exploitive elements of capitalism from manifesting in these new partnerships. But also I think we need to learn from how there is this diffusion of culture, right? And how that can lead to innovation, but how do we capitalize on that in a way that is mutually beneficial? I think the idea of joint ventures is one that has a lot of promise. And I think there are really, really interesting other models that we can follow. So there is a lot of work about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and industry folks who then go back to their home country and they build industries based on the knowledge they've gained working in Silicon Valley. So there's a really great example with Israel and also Taiwan. So how do we also think about reproducing those other models where there essentially was no industry? I think in Israel, I think it was for microchips. And because of a few entrepreneurs who had gained a lot of experience in the US and then migrated back to Israel, they essentially built this industry from the ground up, and now it's one of the leading in the world. So how do we imitate or emulate some of those other models? I think we don't see as often this sort of transnational migration or return migration. And I think that was one way to sort of reinvest some of those talents and skills that might be cultivated once people migrate. I think that's also important.
Julia, there's some themes that have come up that have reminded me of some conversations that we've had about your personal story, but also about your company. Maybe be curious to hear what your thoughts and reflections on it are.
Yeah, just, building on some of Cassie's thoughts, I'm also really inspired by the power of entrepreneurship, and particularly Black and African entrepreneurs creating more fluidity across borders. Some of the technological sort of innovations that could really spur that would be, I'd like to see more bilateral payments infrastructure so that the flow of capital across borders wasn't controlled by folks like Western Union, for example. And whether it's microtransactions or large venture capital transactions, just seeing capital flow more seamlessly across borders. I was on a Clubhouse talk listening to, I think it was Mark Andreessen, saying that there's $1 trillion worth of capital right now in the venture ecosystem that doesn't know where to go. And I think that's a crazy number when you think about it, but there are probably, hundreds of thousands of venture backable businesses that are operating right now in Africa that could be funded by venture capitalists in Silicon Valley if we could somehow cause the capital to flow more easily across borders, which is in part about cultural fluency, but there are some still structural impediments to making those things happen.
Henry, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with what every panelist has said. And going back to Wilmot and Cassie, all those, I think wealth does matter, right? I think particularly wealth at the collective kind of community standpoint, right? Because even as we have seen, new Black billionaires, kind of up into the scheme of things, we still, as a race of people, African Americans are a poor class of people in terms of capital, right? I think the wealth of knowledge, the wealth of skills, the wealth of talent, all that's always been there. It's always been there. And so part of the challenge of having, when you don't have the capital there, is that you have to kind of what gets developed is based on what other people see that they want to get developed, right? And I think that's one of the biggest issues that we face. The golden rules, they say, he or she who has the goal makes the rules, right? So if you, and I just want to kind of from the wealth standpoint, put kind of a statistic or two out there. So if you look at Jeff Bezos, the founder and primary owner of Amazon, Jeff Bezos's net worth is somewhere, right around $200 billion. It's 180, 190 or so. This summer, around August, his net worth got to somewhere like 206. Now, keep in mind, this is after he had divorced his wife, or they had divorced, and she'd taken 25% of his stock, right? He was still worth over $200 billion. She, by just having a divorce herself, became the wealthiest woman in the world, right? $64 billion, $65 billion. If you collectively put together all of the aggregate revenue of the Black businesses in the United States, they do not get to $200 billion. And so you got one individual whose wealth based on his company asset does not equate to the revenue of all the Black businesses in the United States. I mean, that should give you some context of just how big this wealth gap is and why we are faced with some of the challenges as a Black community. We have 7 African-American billionaires kind of based on Forbes, right? Like 5 of those are athletes at any time. You got Tyler Perry, you got Oprah Winfrey, you got Michael Jordan, you got Jay-Z, you got Robert Smith, of course, is the wealthiest. You got I can't remember his name, the guy that owns World Wide Web, the technology. And so I say that to say, I think that there's still a whole lot that we understand needs to happen from a wealth standpoint as a community if we're going to really change the trajectory of not only African Americans but the whole African diaspora across the board.
So maybe following up on that, Henry, and this is for you or for anyone else, what role do you think that Black business, plays in addressing those concerns? Because I think that that reality has been the case, at least in the United States, for the entire period that Black people have been emancipated from slavery, and it's been actively acted against by both state-sanctioned and vigilante, economic violence. And so I'm just curious, what recourse? And there's a host of recourses that are potentially out there, but what recourse do Black communities have in trying to address that directly, albeit not completely, given the disparate numbers we're talking about? But what role do Black communities have in, or should they? Right? Should we even bother?
No, I think you're absolutely right, man. I think there's a role. I think if you look at economically the Black community over time, every time the Black community would kind of build a anchor and grow economically, it would be destroyed, right? You're talking about, we just hit the 100-year anniversary of Tulsa, Oklahoma. You had Rosewood, Florida. You had these other places. You had the Red Summer between, 1919, 40 cities across the United States burned down. In places that didn't get burned down or bombed, you had highway systems running right through them and things like that. So, there's been a long history of this kind of disconnection. The Black farmers who, couldn't get access to loans and all these kind of things add up in an aggregate way to get us to this point. And so certainly we have, felt an enormous weight of that on us. From your question about businesses serves a huge role in terms of addressing that, right? If you look at the wealth gap, it's largely partly driven by the fact that the wealthiest individuals in the world, their companies are part of public markets that grow. They create an enormous amount of wealth. The wealthiest folks in the United States and the world have gotten even wealthier during the pandemic because we're doing, technology like this and things of that nature. So we know that even in down times that wealth attached to certain businesses grow. One of the key aspects of this is really, we have to have ownership, certainly, and we have to also figure out, what does that kind of collective action look like that, as becoming a bigger part of the population and our buying power becoming bigger. It's a challenge, and there's a certain economic hollowness right now to the ownership structure. Several years ago when you first kicked this off, I had did a speech called, In Search for Wakanda, and it was based specifically off the fact that the Black Panther movie made so much money worldwide, became such a huge phenomenon, but very few Black people actually benefited from that economically. We benefited from a pride standpoint and those kind of things, and so even whenever Starbucks stole somebody out of a restaurant or arrest somebody, you could boycott that for a bit, and then all of a sudden, I don't drink coffee, so it wasn't a real issue for me. But we even have hard time these days, like collectively boycotting long enough because at some point you run into the issue of, well, I got to buy groceries, I got to do something, and you know, and who owns those things? So business plays a critical, important role in terms of building that collective wealth that we need and that collective autonomy, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah. Julie, I have a slightly different question for you. In the past year, there has been a tremendous number of wealth that has been verbally committed to Black-owned businesses. I'm curious your thoughts about it, how your company may have interacted with those interests in investing in Black-owned businesses.
Well, it is the case that I saw, and I'm talking from the perspective of sort of Silicon Valley venture capital, which is, you know, probably a voice that has a lot of weight, but is necessarily a small community in terms of geography. But nonetheless, that's the place that I really know deeply. So there were certainly quite a lot of commitments being made by funds who wanted to invest in Black founders, in Black women. I think the investments versus, if you look at the size of some of those commitments versus the overall assets under management for those funds, I think the amount of dollars that folks committed to is certainly underwhelming. For a $100 million fund to make a $1 million commitment, or a $10 billion fund to make a $10 million commitment, I think is underwhelming. There are bright spots on the horizon. Goldman Sachs, for example, just launched its 1 Million Women campaign, investing $10 billion in Black women, not just Black female founders, but also making some ecosystems investments to address disparities in health outcomes, disparities in access to childcare. And so I do see some bright spots on the horizon, but where the rubber meets the road from my standpoint as a working founder, someone who's out raising capital every day, the size of the commitments and the energy behind them certainly doesn't meet the magnitude of the problem that we're trying to solve with structural racism. Nonetheless, I remain hopeful, particularly hopeful about the emergence of Black GPs creating their own funds. Black founders, not just creating private companies, but creating their own venture capital funds. Folks like Charles Hudson from Precursor Ventures, Sarah Kuntz from Clio Capital. Those are the folks that I think are really leading the charge. And I do believe fundamentally in the power of entrepreneurship to create intergenerational wealth. And I think what Henry is talking about is important because it's about ownership. It's about what can you actually own. Intergenerational wealth transfer won't just happen because we increase our salaries. It happens because we have equity in companies that access public markets. And so I do fundamentally believe that entrepreneurship is a really important lever as we try to address this structural inequality.
I'll jump in on this one. I'm optimistic as well. And I'll tell you why. Because of this dual mandate. By that, I mean, first time in my lifetime in which what has converged is a new administration coming in with the same mandate that I think has to be answered because of the way in which President Biden, and by whom primarily in terms of the real catalyst, he was elected, people of color, the African-American community. At the same time, the corporate mandates that we're seeing that Julia just spoke about. And I think the optimism that I have is that this convergence will lead now to real interest in following a compass that can be directed by people of color and that will have a moral basis now. And I in my lifetime, I haven't seen that. Maybe I've read about it from like the time in the 1960s. But where I would like to see it go again is, having spent some time in Wall Street and Silicon Valley and in Hollywood, I really, still point that energy, that interest, the follow-up on that mandate towards getting capital more into companies that can be platform companies with the continent of Africa. I'm a little biased, but if it's math really, right? If you think about 1.2 billion people, that will still probably the youngest population in the world, where there is innate sort of natural resource endowment that is underutilized and maybe badly utilized in many ways. and the talent, the education, the resources of the global diaspora, not just in America and North America, but also in Brazil and Europe. I just think some phenomenal new innovation, cultural renaissance can come out of that. And so it pains me to see so many people, especially African-American people, still slow on the pickup. And that's not being critical, that's being constructively critical, because I think we have bought into a lie about Africa. We've bought into a lie about the power of our ability to assemble, to aggregate, to collaborate, to joint venture, that we now have to say, you know what, we don't have a choice. And so for all those reasons, I think these things are moving in the right direction. And it's just us. I just want to say one other thing about wealth, Mark, that I think is really important. Cassie brought up some amazing points about sort of comparative diaspora engagement. And Cassie, I'd love to write an article with you on some of those things. But what we see in that is an insularity that was foundation of all of that in terms of self-empowerment that was that was normalized. Whereas for African American people, we think that still because it's criticized and it's viewed as being suspicious, that we're doing something wrong almost, that it's unfair to really focus on circulating Black dollars, collective empowerment, where we do it with the continent in Africa. And so I say that another dimension of that wealth that I think is a spiritual basis, I don't want to take the conversation in a different way, is love. I mean, we gotta have more love for ourselves that is, determined, that is focused, that is intentional, and it is unashamed.
Great. Cassie, I know you've worked directly with some corporations. I'm very, very interested to hear what your thoughts.
No, I was going to say, I think, whenever there's a lot of like consumer activism, and I think what we're seeing is a demand on the basis of the public for corporations to be more engaged, to invest more, to cultivate relationships with Black-owned businesses. And so whenever there is consumer activism, you often see corporations responding, but they respond in various ways. So sometimes it's really superficial, and it is performative allyship, and it is just a PR campaign on a very superficial level. And then there are other firms that engage in more sort of long-term and meaningful investments. And I think it is our job to just make sure that we cultivate among the public, among the Black public and the larger public, that there needs to be some accountability long-term. So if you say you support Black communities, Black lives, and you are a proponent of Black-owned businesses, then let's see your KPIs. Let's look at some data. Let's look at some metrics. Let's see over time, are you walking the walk and talking the talk? Because I do think we sometimes allow for less accountability as long as people donate some money. I got an email and it was like Crate & Barrel selling brown blankets that support the NAACP. And I was like, what? And it was like, you can get all different shades of brown. And I was like, this is the most, I don't understand this partnership. And I do understand the symbolic capital of investing and giving some of the profit sharing with the NAACP, but like that did not seem like a meaningful investment. Like, what about your suppliers, Crate & Barrel? What about, ensuring in your pipeline that there are more Black producers who benefit? Ensuring within your own organization on your board. Like, I understand that's beneficial to the NAACP, that's wonderful, but I think we as consumers, and let's get this straight, we have a lot of power through our consumption, through our consumer dollars. I think we need to hold these companies accountable. And really, in some respects, we might see more change by holding corporations accountable than we would if we simply tried to use sort of old-fashioned, not old-fashioned, but political means, right? Because these companies are more responsive. And then the second thing I would say is also thinking about building relationships with other minority communities too, because the racial demographics of the US are changing. And among the Generation X I think that's what they're called, is already almost is majority minority. But we have to build those coalitions too to make some demands. And I think we also need to make sure that we're not, I don't want to say getting played, but it's not just a PR campaign that they're saying that they're investing, but their investment is so unsubstantial, or their investment is in some cause that seems it's not really going to create jobs. That's not really going to create opportunities. That's not really changing any of the ways in which racism is deeply embedded in their own organizational culture. So I think there is room for growth, but we also have to remain proactive and really put people's foot to the fire.
Yeah, can I respond to something that, because I think Cassie you should take that little clip and post it someplace and just kind of let it run, because, what I know, or at least in my own opinion, we're in a very unique time, right? I mean, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, a health pandemic that's driving an economic, crisis, right? And they created for very, very unique circumstances, this past summer. I mean, so, we can kind of call this the pre-George Floyd, the post-George Floyd in some kind of ways right now. Black folks forever have been talking about Black people getting killed and, by police officers, shot, things of that nature. But somehow, it's this moment in time is like all of a sudden, kind of folks supposedly woke up. But, I don't think that we can discount the fact that what corporations saw as a result of that was a multicultural, kind of multi-generational group of people that marched all over the world now. It wasn't just America. I mean, it's all over the world, came out, showed up, right? And I think they recognize, wait a minute, those are our customers. My customers are saying Black Lives Matter. And guess what? They're not all Black, right? They're not all brown. They're actually all these colors. And so all of a sudden, you saw corporations willing to come out and make public statements that they were never willing to make before. And so, I think to Cassie's point, for me, I mean, I'm always about more, money getting into the Black ecosystem and diaspora, all those kind of things. But I think it's still a lot still remains to be seen as to kind of what is real and what is whitewashing, right? I mean, in the environmental space, we used to call it greenwashing, right? You take something that you've been doing the whole time and you just all of a sudden say it's environmentally friendly and try to get people, I think there's some version of whitewashing going on right now where, oh yeah, we're doing this and we really care. And I think it's just a matter of, I think time will tell. I actually have a student of mine that I've asked to actually capture all these commitments in kind of a research database to say, okay, who made the commitment? What did they say they were doing? Kind of who are the part, all these kind of things. Because I think we do have to hold them accountable. Because again, we got to see what's real and what's Memorex.
So we've got we actually have 2 sessions next week that approach this topic. So hopefully people will tune back in for those. I want to go a little further on this thing about accountability. So in the discussions we had this morning around the Black Commons, so the conversation was really about Black people creating, in some cases, separate economies as a way to exert control over their lives and their community. And then on Monday, we had some conversations around education and parenting, and some themes came around exerting that control. But in all those conversations, we also came up, how do we hold entities, whether it's elected officials, whether it's teachers, how do we hold those entities accountable for teaching Black youth, for keeping their promises after they're elected? And so in this case, how do we actually do that accountability thing? I know it's we can boycott, but what does that actually look like? Are there examples that we can point to? I mean, one recently I think about is the Goya thing, but I don't know if that actually had any real impact on the Goya brand. But just would be curious, like, how do we actually hold these entities that are making these commitments accountable for what they claim they're going to do? That's for anyone.
There's probably no silver bullet solution. And I think each of us has to look at what area we're operating in and where we can use our unique experience to exert accountability. If you're in the field of journalism, for example, that's one place to start. But I will say that I am increasingly inspired by the power of social media in many of these cases to get the word out. And I think in a post-Instagram, post-Twitter society, even someone who doesn't even have a huge platform can have an outsized impact using their voice. And I see this happening really well, particularly with Gen Z at the helm, or Gen X at the helm, as Cassie mentioned. I think that increasingly people are getting messages out and actually being able to organize using social media as a tool.
Others have any thoughts there? And maybe Cassie, if I could just ask you, maybe talk a little bit more about specific work that you may have done with corporations around some of these issues.
I mean, you raise a really great point. I think in general, we need a both and approach, right? So we need to have some things that are within our own community, within our own control, but we live in a society where it's not possible in every domain, right? So at the same time, we need allies and advocates within those institutions and organizations that are going to ensure that our experiences are optimal, or at least parable with our white counterparts or others. So I think it like Julia is saying, we need a diverse strategy. There's no silver bullet. We need to have a multi-layered strategy. And I think part of that is retaining, and there's so much interesting research about, child development and how having a strong Black identity and having a sense of self is actually best for academic achievement. So, we can integrate into, and if you look across the board, in a lot of spaces where you have access to capital, it's mostly white. So we can integrate those spaces, but I think it's always good to maintain a sense of self that is, in some sense, uncompromising. So I do think I would say from my own research on the Black middle class, they're extremely culturally dexterous, and that is an advantage and it's an asset. So being able to be diplomatic, navigate different type of social terrains, I think is something that is advantageous to have. And I think, part of that means I do think we need to preserve Black spaces because they do and function in ways that are really uniquely beneficial. So in my own research on sort of retail racism, a lot of times Black people, the places where they don't get hemmed up and caught up is in a Black owned establishment, right? And those are protective spheres. They're buffered from sort of being treated discriminatorily there. But at the same time, they should be able to shop wherever and not be treated discriminatorily. So I think it's sort of a both and solution. In terms of my work with corporations, like I said, they really do vary in terms of their level of investment. But I do think the most sort of, the people who are trying to think in advance for the future are cognizant that their consumer base is diverse and that you can't continue to mistreat a large fraction of your potential consumer base and your potential employee base as well. So, it's not just about consumers, but it's also about who you're able to hire. And that's changing. The demographics of the labor market are changing. So I think it does behoove us in general to have, to cultivate human capital among African Americans. That's to the benefit of the country, not just to the benefit of the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say also, yeah. I mean, I think that these are great points. I'd say a couple of things. So, on the broader level, if you look at the dynamics and the data, it shows you essentially that as was said earlier, racial minorities are becoming the majority of the overall U.S. population from just a basic demographic standpoint. Hispanics have kind of more offspring. They're kind of at top of the list, Black folks in there. And so at some point, so right around the year 2040, 2044, the expectation is that the racial minorities now will become the majority of the population. Now, simultaneous data point that's happening though is that those Black and brown populations are becoming poorer, right? From a median wealth standpoint. And so, now this is pre-pandemic data, right? Pre-pandemic data, the expectation was that the Black population would reach a zero median wealth by the year 2053. That means median wealth means that half the population is above that, half the population below. that so by 2053, Blacks will reach a median of zero wealth. By 2073, Latinos will reach that same number, zero wealth, median of zero wealth. Well, you know, for years, those things have been happening that decline, and folks have just kind of say, well, it is what it is. But, and you know, it's supposedly been a problem for the community, but guess what? When the majority of your population has a zero or negative wealth, it's not just a problem for that population, it's a problem for the whole country, right? And so again, this is pre-pandemic numbers. I think that it's going to be critical that all the talent and the wealth and all these kind of things that we're talking about is put towards the community upbuilding of this process, because it's been destroyed for so long. When I talk to mayors and work around in different cities, and they always, you know, everybody wants a silver bullet, say, hey, you know, Henry, you know, what are the one or two things that we should be doing to address this issue? And I'm like, look, Mayor, I'm happy to tell you, you know, this or that, but guess what? It wasn't one or two things that got us here. And it's not going to be one or two things that gets us out of this. I mean, it's really, you know, takes kind of all these kind of things kind of happening at once. I mean, all the things that my fellow panelists are saying, it needs to happen at once. I say one thing, you know, with the Generation Z and others, you know, we have to see how it plays out, but you know, interesting kind of phenomenon, if you kind of draw some analogies, is that you know, you're starting to see more, you know, say all-star 5-rated athletes who are deciding they're willing to go to a HBCU, right? Which is in some ways, I mean, it's monumental from what has happened in the past. And so it's saying, well, hey, you know, maybe I can take my talent and my the attention and the research with it to places that would otherwise not get that. I mean, because you got to understand, I mean, it's that kind of that dichotomy of, well, the Black athlete has been the driver of so much wealth creation and attention, all these kind of things, yet HBCUs historically hadn't been able to compete kind of in recent times with that. And so you got to ask yourself, well, what's going on here? And so I think that you know, we have to be vigilant, and also we have to really understand the problem that we're facing. And I kind of finish with this. I get so many people that come to me, and their solution is you know, always this issue of, well, hey, what can we do to kind of fix the African-American entrepreneur, right? How can we, let's do some technical, you know, training, let's do all these kind of things. And look, I've been around long enough, they're bringing us everywhere. I mean, everywhere. And, you know, and it's the system that we don't spend enough time looking at. I mean, you know, the idea that somehow always falls on our back, that we just must not be smart enough. We must not know how to find an accountant, or we must not know how to find a lawyer. So let me just hold your hand and show it. Let me draw the map of an ecosystem for you. This is a lawyer. This is an accountant. Now, you know, go be prosperous, Negro. I mean, that's kind of the approach that we have. What we need is the understanding that the system itself that is suppressing Black business creativity and innovation and all those kind of things by saying, well, here's a capital stack. We're going to decide what we're willing to invest in for you and what kind of innovation we're willing to invest in. I mean, that's got to change if we're going to really see the change that we want to see, broadly speaking.
Let me,
Mark.
oh, go ahead, Wilmot.
I was just going to say something very quickly. I think I agree with what's been said. I think in terms of this accountability question, what I would add is that, and I think it was just stated in part, is the importance of interclass coalitions now. I think whether it's, you know, what's happened in the wake of the social reckoning that's happened, COVID as well. And that's important for a few different reasons, because I think that increasingly we're being bifurcated by net worth and capital and financial accumulation. But I think we need, you know, to highlight some of the great benefits or the blessings, if you will, that have come out of our experience globally, especially and also in America. And one is the value of empathy. I think that these interclass coalitions can really push that forward. Second is understanding that I think, anyway, and others may see it differently, that while we live in a capitalistic system, financial wealth is important, but reckoning with that so that it's not seen as the center of our significance, but as a resource now that can help more people, and including ourselves in our own communities. I think that you know, a values-based approach is emerging that I find very encouraging. that for many, including the younger generations, is now a reevaluation of how wealth and meaning and purpose kind of integrate together, and what that means for making the world and America a better place for more people in terms of opportunity.
Well, I'm going to connect this directly to Julia here. How do you think about sort of this idea about values-based and creating, making the world a better place, but finding value in that in terms of customers and et cetera?
Yeah, so my work is at the intersection of food systems and climate change. So, my company Planet Forward is all about using the power of the private sector to create this really important social and environmental change that we all need to happen. I believe there is no social justice without climate justice, and the ravages of climate change will disproportionately affect folks who look like us. But at the same time, I'm working in the private sector, right? And so the imperative for me is to create a profitable, scalable company. But the profit for me is really what gives me permission to scale. The profit is not the point in and of itself. The point is the impact that I can drive through my business. Some people fundamentally believe in the power of the public sector to create change, and they're really well suited to become politicians and policymakers. Some people believe in the power of media, and they're really well suited to become journalists and public speakers. But my lane is entrepreneurship. That's what I was born and bred to do. And so that's the area where I work. I do tend to believe that, and it's my case even as an investor. I do quite a bit of angel investing. I find that Black founders, more so than the general population, are building businesses at the intersection of commerce and social change. I find that more often than not, there is some social justice component to businesses that Black founders are creating. And that's incredibly exciting to me.
One kind of thread I wanted to throw back in here. So we talked a little bit about holding investors and large corporations accountable, but I want to kind of go back to this idea about what are the avenues for wealth generation amongst, and I'll say the diaspora. And this aligns with one of the questions that we have, which I'll read. So I agree that there's a lot of global potential for Black folks and people of color. I wonder how Black international people can break through the monopolies, I'd say like De Beers for diamonds and oligopolies in countries of Africa, like Chinese companies have been purchasing assets. So maybe the panel can sort of talk about that. And I know, Wilmot, you may want to jump in on this first, but if we take a step back and look at that for the diaspora, what is that potential grow to look like?
Yeah, I think we have to start by getting to know each other and working together better. We had a conference, Venture Lift Africa, with the MBDA Export Center, the MBDA, last year, called the Diaspora Investment and Trade Deal Event. And it was a great event. People attended. It was a deal event, meaning we were connecting investors, trade partners, tech transfer partners, people who wanted to engage the continent with talent. And it was bi-directional, going both ways for sure. But what we knew also was that, with all of the enthusiasm about that African Americans have, for example, year of return going to Ghana, is that there's so much opportunity for an African American young man or woman to get to know the historical diaspora, to get to know that second generation Nigerian immigrant at their church that they never speak to, or it lives 2 houses down. And so I think what I would say is the foundation has to be some investment in social capital, education, learning, empathy, getting to understand different experiences. Because when you have transnational identities, which most of our African immigrant brothers and sisters have, it changes everything. The gentleman who just raised a lot of money for Calendly, the CEO and founder that pointed that out. He said, you know what? I trace it to my roots growing up in West Africa, in Nigeria, transnational identity, where he said, I was able to kind of, get to know Black wealth and the ability of Black capital, in this case through Syncom, to influence change for Black entrepreneurs. But the other thing he said was he didn't get caught up with his identity being so what's the best word? So harmed by the struggle for racial equality in America. And so I think that that foundation, again, I always start with values and things that I think are going to be the foundation long-term for business endeavors. And then after that, I think it is the demonstration effect of having successful enterprises scale in Africa that presents a demonstration effect to the international investment community, to, believe it or not, to our African brothers and sisters here on the continent who frankly don't know African Americans, I think, in a circumspect way. By that I mean media primarily. We know that a lot of those images are very negative. And so I think that, and then I'll give you one example. I'm involved as a co-founder in a genomics company called Indigenous. Two Howard scientists and myself and East African doctor are owners. And what it is, we have seen, they have seen, I'm the business person, but they have seen the impact of COVID, HIV, and the underrepresentation in clinical trials. So what we're doing is building a large sort of what's called a multi-omic biobank, genomic data, medical data, demographic data, healthcare records data, to better develop treatments, drugs, drug discovery, disease surveillance for people of African descent. And it's a collaboration between the African scientific community and the African-American scientific community. I'm really excited about it because, again, it's a demonstration effect. We're raising, we haven't proven our model yet, but we're on our way. I think there are other companies like that can, again, begin to have successes and demonstrate the power of this collaboration.
Can I just chime in? I was just going to say that, at least with regard to sort of building that social capital and those social networks, the Black middle class in the US is very multi-ethnic, right? And even if you think about, I was just thinking about Howard. The president of Howard is from the Caribbean. Now one of the most probably well-known Howard alum is of mixed race, right? So I think that there always has been a lot of diversity within the Black US population, but it's particularly true among the college educated and the middle class. And I think some of those social capital connections are eventually will forge into sort of entrepreneurial ventures. But a lot of that is just now in the sort of early stages where we're seeing a much more a concentration of sort of immigrants within the Black middle class, and there's increasingly building of relationships and rapport between Black institutions across the diaspora, including the Caribbean and in Africa. So, I even think about anecdotally my own college experience where, my best friends were from the Ivory Coast, were from Jamaica, all over from Florida. So, I think that there's a great deal of potential and room, and we should be hopeful that those social relationships will translate into exchange of ideas, innovation, and entrepreneurship, within a generation or two.
I'd like to add, to just piggyback on that in terms of international piece. I think that everything that was said is really important and critical because, this is the Black Communities Conference, right? And you named it for that for a particular reason. And I want to kind of hold it up for a moment because I think it's important to this discussion about the journey. Now we have the BIPOC kind of tag, Black, Indigenous, people of color. You have, it's interesting. I kind of, it's almost like, this whole kind of racial reckoning thing. You watch commercials now, and it seems like every couple is like like mixed race. I mean, it's like you kind of moved into this unique space right now. But I mention that because I always like to say though that, I mean, even when talking about entrepreneurship, I've studied entrepreneurs of kind of all different populations and races, things of that nature. We got to understand just like the human kind of experience, the entrepreneur experience. I mean, there just has been something kind of unique about the Black experience, period. I mean, just in terms of how we got here, right? And so when I look at other kind of, minorities, racial minorities in terms of their entrepreneurial ecosystems, you have these kind of ways by which they may work together and they create these kind of investment clubs. And then you have folks who've come from other countries and that country, you know, they connect to the population in the U.S. because it creates new markets and things of that nature. I mean, we have to realize, I mean, the way Black folks got here historically has just been very different, right? I mean, and that's, I think, created some of the challenges of making that homeland connection, which I'm hoping as they're talking here, is that is changing, right? Because you have different, you know, folks that are coming into the population from these countries and they're migrating here and things of that nature. But there's just been a different history in terms of that upbuilding of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that America and Africa just haven't had from that standpoint. And I think that we have to really acknowledge and understand that. So when people say, oh, well, you know, y'all just need to do like other folk and all these kind of things, I mean, it's just a different history. And so I always want to just, you know, be cognizant that what I think that means is that I think we have to be even more resilient about building those bridges and those relationships, creating that social capital, and understanding that it is a different experience, right? Just like the Black experience is different from other kind of entrepreneurial experiences, just like the Black female experience is different than other, I mean, you know, all those kind of things are important to understand as we try to address these issues that we face.
Maybe one thing I'll add there, I agree. I will just say that there have been attempts, you know, about these economic bridges between African Americans and the continent. And I'll just say, you know, hopefully this has changed now, but there has been very active state determination to break those bonds, right? Not just, you know, before the Civil War, but since then. And so I think it's, you know, it's not just that there's this unique history. There's also been active state action that's directed at keeping Black wealth, Black business, Black political agency from flourishing.
I think that's part of the history, though. I mean, I think that's just like I said, whenever in America, for example, whenever you try to create a Black economic basis and then somebody comes through and runs a, you know, they bomb it or they blow. I mean, that's a unique history that and I think what you just said, that, you know, I always, you know, what I try to frame my work around now is this idea of, you know, racial economic equity by design, right? Because you have actually, I mean, we've seen racial inequity by design. I mean, it didn't happen by accident. I mean, if you look at the history, I mean, this stuff was designed to the nth degree. And so I think that all the things that you're saying about, you know, what has been those impediments, I mean, you really just, sometimes you have to just lift up the hood and say, okay, man, I thought, you know, people, and part of the difference is that people will take that to be some naturalized effect whenever it really was somebody behind the scenes just pulling strings, right? Pulling strings and saying, oh, well, we're actually going to do this. So I think that's a part of that unique history that's gotten us here that is not always acknowledged on the broader folks who would rather say, oh, well, no, you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
So Mark, can I just say one quick thing, make one quick point about what you said about sort of state sanctioned disparities. And I'll just say this. I think that this is important to know because it's happening on our watch right now. And then sometimes it's not what's done directly or even intentionally, it's what's not done. And so, for example, for those who are interested in engaging with Africa, do you know there's so many tax-funded programs to do so through USAID right now? And I have engaged with them in critical dialogue, honest dialogue, and very respectfully that when you have an initiative like the Prosper Africa Trade Initiative that's come out now this year, $500 million to promote two-way trade investment, and you have nothing earmarked for the diaspora, we ought to be concerned about that. If African American and African, if the combined historical and contemporary diaspora communities, just in the US alone, were a country in Africa, be the 9th largest, by far the richest. And if we can aid and abet as a country, you know, diasporic engagement for Israel, for India, for Ireland, and not with our, you know, the people who helped build America and came here largely involuntarily, then that's be an issue. But it's happening in the dark because not many Black private sector enterprises who are looking to engage internationally at all, first of all, they may not be pointed towards Africa, and secondly, they may not know about these programs. So I just want to say to the audience, because I know this is on the topic of diaspora empowerment, there are programs that are tax funded, state sanctioned that we can take advantage of right now that largely are going to other people who see this as the big opportunity for a new scramble for Africa. Many well-intended millennials, but have no regard for there being any sort of legitimacy to a preferential status for the African diaspora in America. And I think that's very, very problematic when it comes to U.S. direct engagement with Africa and leaving and not including provisions such as that.
So we're at time, but I do want to throw in one quick question I can for Julia, if possible. We had a question about changing the perspective of Black-owned businesses around scalability. And so the reason I'm thinking about you in terms of your angel investing, just briefly, if you could talk a little bit about the types of conversations you have with these Black founders that you want to invest in about the full wealth potential of the endeavors that they're trying to do. Potentially, is that may not be what they're first thinking about, as you mentioned, for example, that they have a socially minded tack on why they're starting their business.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of it's a little bit of a myth that socially minded founders are not also thinking about scalability. I think actually really big problems create really big markets. And so when you're tackling things like structural racism, climate change, you are thinking big. But what I will say is I'm inspired by the fact that the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs is Black women by far and away. But I often find that it's the case with many women who are entrepreneurs that they hold themselves to much too high of a standard when going out to raise capital. And they forget that a lot of times, two white guys who dropped out of Stanford and are living in a garage can access $10 million in an angel round. And so the advice that I tend to give to Black female entrepreneurs in particular is to not hold yourself to the standard of having to be so perfect, and to not assume, to not talk yourself out of a deal, to not talk yourself out of an investor, and to really just go for it, because chances are you're already holding yourself to a much higher standard than your peers are.
Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Henry, Cassie, Wilma. This has been really great. We have a collab session that's happening in a few minutes. Our panelists are welcome to join us there, but it's going to be a very invigorating conversation, I believe, with those attendees that decide to come. So thank you so much for talking with us. This was very wonderful, enlightening conversation.